इंडिया स्पीक्स डेली को सब्सक्राइब करें, उसके बेल आइकन को ज़रूर दबाएं यदि आपको इसकी पत्रकारिता पसंद हो। धन्यवाद।
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to India Speaks Daily. In the latest round of developments regarding the anti-CAA, that is the Citizenship Amendment Act protests, a new voice of criticism has emerged from the Army Chief of India, General Rawat, General Bipin Rawat, that is. And speaking in context of the anti-CAA protests that recently took over the country, General Bipin Rawat was speaking in an event on Thursday, and he said that he commented that leaders are not those who lead people in inappropriate directions. So without naming any political party as such, without explicitly referring to any particular political party, General Bipin Rawat, the Army Chief of India, made a comment on the sort of negativities of leadership, made a comment on the opportunism that certain leaderships indulge in and maneuver people, manipulate the country's public in a way that they commit irrational acts of arson or violence. So he was speaking with regard to the anti-CAA protests and sort of criticizing the negative leadership in general in a generalized context that leads people, especially the educated youth of India, to indulge in various acts of violence. Now, of course, the Congress and the opposition parties were quick to jump on the criticism bandwagon. Just within a couple of hours of the Army Chief's comments making it to the media pages, the left liberal media of India was full of reports carrying comments from the bigwigs of various opposition political parties, the Congress as well as the left party, criticizing the Army Chief's comments, General Rawat comments, and sort of indicting the comments. Lok Sabha MP Asaduddin Owaisi also criticized Army Chief's comments, and he wrote in his Twitter handle specifically that a leadership is knowing the limits of one's office, and it's about understanding the idea of civilian supremacy and preserving the integrity of the institution that you head. So these kind of comments were made by leaders of various political parties. Now, of course, one has to understand that the negative comments made by various political parties regarding the Army Chief's statement reflect their own mindset rather than the Army Chief's mindset. That is, these comments expose the fears, doubts and paranoia of the left and the Congress with regard to the anti-CAA protests. They're scared of the fact that if the Army Chief's comments are taken seriously by the youth of India, that if the Army Chief's comments are taken in the right context and the young people of India who were involved in these protests, if they understand the real import and the real motive behind the Army Chief's comments, that is, the youth should not irrationally process any information and act in an aggressive manner, and that the it is the onus of the leadership to act in a responsible manner. So the Congress and the left are scared that the anti-CAA protests, which have already started to become peaceful, will completely lose their momentum, and the Congress and the left will be out of business. They will be completely out of business. Their shops will be totally shut down if the Army Chief's comments are sort of taken by the public at a serious level. So that's why this move by the Congress and the left to sort of unleash this volley of comments in the left liberal media criticizing the Army Chief, and this sort of propaganda by them to give a political color, to give a political dimension to the comments made by the Army Chief. Very, very unfortunate in a democracy. Now, let's examine the allegations that were made against the Army Chief, that that were basically the ground for these for the criticisms on the army chief's comments. So the army chief General Bipin Rawat was basically he has been accused of overstepping the boundaries of his office by making supposedly political comments. He has been accused of going outside the confines and boundaries of his office by supposedly entering the political domain by commenting on various political parties. Now let's counter this one by one. To begin with, the army chief has not explicitly referred to any political party. He hasn't named any political party as such, nor has he explicitly talked about CAA as well. He hasn't explicitly referred to the anti-CAA protests. What the army chief is rather doing, he's talking about the complex interplay, the complex nexus of power and politics in a contemporary society, India being the society in this case. He's talking about the complex interplay of power and politics, which often leads to young people indulging in acts of irrational violence. So the army chief's comments are made in a generalized context, and he's basically attacking the institutionalized vested interests which build their own propaganda theory, and in order to fulfill their own interests, they misguide the youth of the country, and which is something that leads to the mob mentality, and the youth is then sort of led down a path where they do not use their rational faculties, and they indulge in these sporadic acts of violence. So the army chief is making an ethical observation in society. He's expressing concern at the increasing involvement of youth in activities of violence across the country. And in terms of anti-CAA protests, he's talking about a distorted leadership pushing the youth in a certain direction and instigating them further, rather than giving them rational advice, rather than actually informing them, educating them about the contents of the Citizenship Amendment Act, so that they can make an informed choice. So General Bipin Rawat's comments are entirely ethical comments, and they completely fall in the ethical domain, where he's expressing concern at a situation where the people of India, especially the educated youth who participated in these protests in huge numbers, he's expressing concern at them becoming pawns in a power game of politics. So by no stretch of imagination, the army chief's comments can be construed as political. And secondly, when the Congress and the left, the other opposition parties, they're talking about the army chief overstepping the prerogatives of his office, that too is completely wrong. Because as the army chief of the country, General Rawat has every prerogative. He basically has every right to alert people to a situation where the national security of the country could be at stake. So if the sporadic acts of violence by students are leading to situations of clashes between the police and the students, and if it's leading to uncontrollable situations, then as the army chief of the country, he's actually justifying his office by talking about this situation and not overstepping the boundaries of his office. It is rather the Congress and the left actually, and these other political opposition parties who are overstepping the boundaries of their office. Because in a democracy, a healthy debate with the opposition, a healthy criticism by the opposition of the mainstream government is something which is the norm. But criticizing the army chief of India and sort of tarnishing his reputation and drawing and trying to paint his comments in a negative light, in a political light, is something which is not becoming of a democracy. So it is rather the Congress and the left which are overstepping their political rights and privileges, and not General Rawat. Now, the army chief's comments, in between this volley of criticism, there are also voices of sanity, and there's some people who have come out in support of General Rawat. For example, the former army chief and current Union Minister Singh has come out in support, and he has said that the army chief's comments should be seen in a specific context. And that if he's telling students not to indulge in damages to public property, if he's telling students not to commit acts of sporadic violence, then he's by no means being political. And if anybody has a doubt about the army chief's intention behind these statements, then they should straight away ask him to give an explanation, a justification, rather than creating an unnecessary controversy around his comments. Because it all boils down to one thing, and let's accept it, that the Congress and the left are slowly losing their grip on the CAA narrative. The entire narrative around CAA, which was orchestrated by them, the entire propaganda which was maneuvered and sort of orchestrated by them, is slowly dying, as protests across the country are getting more and more peaceful now, except Uttar Pradesh, of course, where there's a lot of violence still happening, as people are increasingly getting to know through the government's awareness drives as to what CAA actually entails, and that it is not detrimental to the interests of Indian Muslims at all. So the entire narrative of the Congress and left is about to fall like a pack of cards. So obviously they're worried as to what will happen next. What will be the next strategy to keep this public anger simmering, so that they can get even a better hold on their vote banks. So it is precisely this desperate attempt by the Congress and the left to create a new narrative that this whole criticism of the army chief's comments, this whole trying to put his comments in a political context and trying to tarnish his reputation, is a part of.